Welcome back for another Friday Night In. We're jumping back into a new two-parter tonight, exploring the wonderful world of urban legends and how strong our beliefs can be. So strap in. This is The No-Face Man, Part 1. His name was Davy Jenkins. He was 11, and he was the worst kid in town. The moniker didn't come easily, but Davy worked hard for it. It had been the better part of a year now his mother and Paul had been trying to go out on an uninterrupted date. Paul came into the picture 3 years after Davy's father's death. They did not get along. Davy had always been a creative kid and loved making frightening masks out of papier-mâché and costumes out of old clothes and dark blankets. He'd been creative in other ways too, like playing pranks on people. People like Paul. Davy started small, testing the limits. He switched the sugar with the salt in the kitchen. Paul loved his coffee sweet, so when he filled his cup one morning and took the first sip, there was a near catastrophe. Paul threw up all over the table. The culprit was quickly identified as Davy, who was laughing from the other side of the kitchen. The punishment was a stern talking to from his mother, and nothing from Paul. This showed Davy one thing: Paul was a weak man, and to Davy, he had no business with his mother. The thought of them spending time alone, out for dinner or a show, without him, made Davy tremble with anger. He had no way of ruining their date nights from home. And then Davy realized how he could. The babysitters. It was simple. Davy would wait an hour into the date before he unleashed some frightening prank on whichever high school girl was minding him that night. He used the false faces, masks, and costumes, plus fiddled with the fuse box in the basement to create the most frightening scenarios for the babysitters. Once the power went out, he'd hide from the sitter, but followed her around in the shadows while she looked for the fuse. He'd wait for the right moment before springing out on her, scaring her half to death. Sometimes he'd go as far as to climb into the vents and make strange sounds. He loved watching the girls go from putting up a fake front of confidence as they searched the house to being absolutely terrified. If the sitter didn't call his parents after that, he had other, more traumatizing tactics. One of the babysitters, Scarlett, got it the worst. After surviving the first assault of blackout and mask attack, Scarlett found Davy a half hour later at the bottom of the basement stairs. He was laying in a heap, blood pooling from his head and mouth. His body was twitching. Davy had fallen down the old stairs and looked to be dead. Scarlett very nearly fell down the stairs herself when she tried to rush down to him, screaming and crying. She went so far as to call an ambulance, and when the paramedics and Paul and his mother arrived in tears, Davy threw his hands up and started laughing. "Got you," he yelled. The babysitter was so angry she left without taking the money she was owed. She never wanted to see them again. There'd been a long gap between date nights since then. Scarlett was the 9th babysitter attempt, and it seemed like Paul had run out of options among the 3 high schools in their town. Then he found one. The neighborhood had been peppered with flyers on telephone poles for a babysitter with lots of references. Her name was Mallory Jacobs. Davy had no idea what to expect, whether she was a high schooler or an old woman. If it was an old woman, Davy wasn't sure how to handle it. There was the obvious and real possibility that the woman would have an actual heart attack, which made Davy even more angry. Paul had figured out a way to cause him to behave with the sitter by making the sitter into a frail eggshell. Paul had outsmarted him. At least, that's what Davy was thinking, until Mallory showed up. It was a rainy October, and Davy was watching from his bedroom window, waiting for the sitter's arrival. Usually that came in the form of headlights, with the sitter's mom or dad dropping them off, or sometimes them driving themselves. But tonight, the headlights were replaced by a lone bike light, carrying a large black shadow. A knot formed in Davy's stomach, and he felt himself hoping the bike continued on, passing his house. But it didn't. It turned right up the driveway into his front door. A moment later, the doorbell rang, and Davy was summoned down to meet his sitter. Mallory wasn't an old woman. She was another high schooler. Her pale face seemed to float in her large, puffy raincoat. The mascara painted around her eyes had streamed down her cheeks, and her long, dark hair clung to her wet skin. She was late, so Paul and Andy didn't have the time to show her around. They introduced Davy and Mallory, then rushed off to their reservation. Mallory pulled her bulky raincoat off to reveal a tiny frame in a black tank top and baggy black pants, soaked from the knee down. She was pale and thin. Her arms were covered in strange scars that multiplied around her wrists. Davy was immediately uneasy. They stood in the entrance, staring at each other. She wasn't blinking. Finally, she spoke, but when she did, it was almost a whisper. He couldn't hear what she said, so he responded with a, "Huh?" Mallory walked over to him, leaned in until their noses were almost touching, and whispered, "Where's the kitchen?" Davy shakily pointed down the hall. Mallory glided past him and disappeared in the kitchen. After a moment of courage gathering, he followed. Mallory was over the sink. Her backpack was on the counter, and she'd taken out a glass bottle filled with milk and 3 slices of bread. She poured herself a full glass and drank it all. She finished and placed it in the sink. She left the bread slices on the counter by the stove. Mallory turned back to Davy and again asked something too quietly for him to hear. This time, he didn't make a sound, so she moved towards him, coming up close again. Her breath smelled like milk and turned Davy's stomach. He was lactose intolerant, and the mere smell sent him off. Mallory told him she wanted a tour of the upstairs. He told her that she was welcome to show herself around, but she insisted, and nervously, Davy followed Mallory up to the 2nd floor. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes staying on Davy. Upstairs, Mallory walked past the bathroom, Annie and Paul's room, the guest room, Paul's office, and straight for Davy's. He stayed at the door as Mallory walked in to explore. It was a horror fan's dream, walls filled with movie posters and shelves with comics and DVDs and Freddy and Jason and Michael toys and paraphernalia. All Davy's arts and crafts projects were on display, and his work desk was covered in what appeared to be some kind of scaled mask with an alligator-type snout with teeth. Mallory examined it. It was the mask Davy had been hoping to use on her that night, which was now not happening. Mallory turned her attention to the bed. She sat down on one side, stretching her legs out. Aside from his mother, there'd never been a girl on Davy's bed before, and seeing one there filled him with all kinds of strange emotions. Like dread, Mallory patted the spot beside her and beckoned Davy to join. Davy didn't move. He didn't know what to do. Mallory spoke, her voice now loud and raspy. "Would you like me to come get you?" She patted the spot again, a warm smile taking over. Davy joined her on the bed, uneasy but unsure of what else to do. Mallory asked him if he knew any scary stories. Of course, he knew plenty, but none rose up in Davy's mind. He was too on edge with this new, strange sitter, so Mallory offered her own. "Do you know the story of the no-face man?" she asked. Davy shook his head. "Is it real?" Davy replied. "Depends. I'll explain that at the end. But first, I need you to make me a promise." "Okay." Mallory said, very seriously now, "What I'm about to tell you, promise me you won't believe it." Davy was perplexed. "So it's not true?" "That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, don't believe it." Davy was still confused, but interested. "Okay, I promise I won't believe it," he responded. "Good. The myth takes place in our town, years and years ago, when our grandparents were our age, when secrets could be kept, when belief could save you, before it was turned against us. His name was John Baptist. He was named after the church he'd been discovered outside as a newborn, abandoned by young parents. He was raised in the church and was said to have an unfaltering commitment and unwavering belief in the Lord and what could be achieved with that belief. John rarely ventured out from the church, and when he did, he only wore masks that he made himself out of paper and cardboard. Very few people saw him, and even less saw his face, if you could call it that. John's face was deformed, very deformed. In fact, it looked like it was inside out, and his tall and bulky stature gave way to his nickname, the Hunchback of John Baptist. But that's not what the kids called him. They called him the No-Face Man. The kids were cruel, but only because they could be. They were never alone in the church. They always had their parents nearby, so they'd taunt John. They'd leave drawings of him amongst the pews, horrible illustrations making him into a monster, jeering and making jokes about his appearance and smell. He reeked of old incense and sweat. John appeared to be a saint, though, and did no wrong. The insults had the same effect of wind hitting the side of a mountain. John had total belief in the Lord, and that this was all for a purpose. This annoyed the children more, and they went after John's lone possession. It was his bicycle, which had a trailer attached that he used to carry equipment around the church's property. The children cut the tires, broke half the spokes in the wheels, and bent the chain. John left his bike and pulled the trailer around himself. His will was untouchable, but the kids had one more idea. They knew the only thing John could really care about now was the Lord and the church, and in particular, there was a large crucifix with a lifelike Jesus Christ statue behind the pulpit. John spent hours every week cleaning any dirt or dust that accumulated on it, so the kids snuck into the church one night and covered the Jesus statue in mud and clay. They turned it into an abomination. They turned it into John. The next day, when John found out what they'd done, he cried, cleaning the statue while he did. The children had crossed a line. The only line. The following morning, 13 children weren't in their beds when their parents checked on them. They'd vanished in the night. It didn't take long for news to travel, and quickly the families of the kids had formed a search party with the police. The group eventually made their way to the church, where they discovered a nightmare. John had set up the children's bodies in the pews, sitting upright. They were all dead. Their faces had been cut off. John himself was standing at the pulpit. He'd made masks out of the children's faces and laid them out behind him. The sheriff put John into a cop car before the mob could pull him apart. He was in custody for less than 12 hours before the entire town went in and broke him out. They wanted his blood. The townspeople took John to the church, where the town butcher skinned him down to muscle. John was still alive, somehow, so they buried him in a coffin filled with rock salt. The town made a collective agreement to never speak of what happened. The story of John Baptist would be buried there forever. Only, some townspeople didn't keep their word, but instead kept the story alive, like a campfire tale, continuing now. Onto you. Ice water ran through Davy's blood. So whatever you do now, don't believe what I told you, even though it's true, because the no-face man only comes to those who believe. And when he does, he takes their faces too, and can wear them as a disguise to get other kids. Mallory held her eyes on Davy, still unblinking. Davy had never been so scared. In any of the movies he'd watched or the comics he'd read, this was another level of fear. He didn't even want to move. Then Mallory excused herself, claiming she was thirsty for another glass of milk. Davy decided to stay upstairs, alone now in an all-too-familiar room, which suddenly felt like someone else's. The posters and statues and figurines were all more menacing. He didn't want to be in there anymore. He wanted to go down to the brightly lit living room and watch something funny. For the first time, he felt done with the scares. His anger towards Paul disappeared. When Davy got to the door, he peeked out and saw the hallway was darker than before. Not only that, but he felt something. It was light, but it immediately caused panic. Incense. Mallory mentioned John reeked of it. Then, ever so faintly, a mist began to rise up the stairs and creep down the hallway. Davy saw the fog getting closer and panicked, slamming the door. He didn't have a lock on it, so he pushed his dresser against the door, blocking it. Davy ran to his closet to hide. There was nowhere else. He opened the slats in the door to see out into his room. The smoke detectors in the hallway were going off. Bump, bump, bump. The door thudded inward. Bump, bump, bump. Davy's dresser slid across the floor as the door was pushed open, and with it, the mist flowed in, filling the room. A red light pulsed out from it. The deep, pained sounds of some large creature breathing, and the smoke detectors ringing out from behind it. The heavy footsteps of the being approached the closet door. Davy stared out at it from the slats, unable to move. The figure came into focus, and Davy screamed and fell back, tripping and landing on the ground hard. The door swung open, and with it, the fog and red pulsing light. The no-face man stood over Davy, who couldn't even bring himself to open his eyes, he was so afraid. The heavy breathing and the deep hum coming from the fog surrounded Davy. His bladder let out, and he pissed himself. All Davy could think to do was repeat the words, "I don't believe you, I don't believe you, I don't believe you, I don't believe you," crying through it all. Then the sounds stopped. For a minute, Davy just laid there, hands covering himself, eyes closed, terrified. Finally, Davy unfurled and peeked out into his room. The no-face man was gone. Tufts of the fog lingered, and the smell of incense still hung, but the room was empty. It was only Davy now. He changed out of his soiled clothes and put on pants. He peeked out into the hallway and saw the smoke was almost all gone. Downstairs, Davy crept to the front door, wanting out of the house, but Mallory called to him from the kitchen. Smoke was coming from it. He followed the smoke trail in and found her at the stove. Mallory was holding a frying pan that was steaming with smoke. Her 3 pieces of bread were burnt black. "Want some toast?" she asked. Davy called his mom. He asked her, pleaded with her to come home. He was terrified. A half hour later, Annie and Paul pulled in. Davy sat on the front steps of the house waiting for them and hugged them both when they arrived. Mallory was paid and said she was available anytime. She tousled Davy's hair, and a whiff of incense filled his nostrils. His stomach dropped, and he nearly felt his bladder open up again. Mallory got on her big, old bike, and Davy realized there was a small trailer attached to it now. That hadn't been there when she arrived. It was exactly like how he imagined the no-face man's bike and trailer to look. Mallory gave Davy a wink before she rode off. Annie was worried about her son, asking what had happened. All Davy could say was that they were telling each other scary stories, and Mallory told a really bad one. He didn't want to talk about it anymore, and he never wanted to see her again. He'd be happy with anyone else, and he promised to behave. Mallory biked several blocks before she took off her wig and started laughing. She turned into the student parking lot of Jefferson High School. A group of small sedans and one minivan were parked in the back. There were 9 girls there, all in a state of overwhelming excitement. As soon as they saw Mallory, they lit off fireworks and a celebration erupted. The sliding door of the van swung open and the no-face man popped out. But it wasn't real. It was a frighteningly lifelike mask, covered in gory detail and slime. The mask and bust was being worn by one of the girls. Another girl in the van turned on an industrial smoke machine and red strobe light behind her. Music blared out as drinks were poured. The 10 girls, 9 former babysitters, and 1 friend had finally gotten revenge on the worst kid in town. One of the girls pulled out her small video camera, displaying a recording of them entering Davy's room, hiding behind the no-face man costume as he was cowering in the closet. The video showed the entire ordeal, with Davy peeing his pants. The girls laughed as they watched and rewatched, enjoying their payback, all being led by Scarlett, Scar to her friends, who was the girl who nearly had a heart attack from the fake-out fall down the basement stairs. She'd put the whole thing together and took pride in what they'd done. They'd finally gotten back at the worst kid in town. And that concludes part 1 of The No-Face Man. We hope you enjoyed the first half, and we'll see you back here next Friday night to meet the babysitters for part 2.